Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at ancient Egypt and modern culture. With me is Dr. Todd Hayen, who is a depth psychologist with a private psychotherapy practice in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He is the author of the recently published book, Ancient Egypt and Modern Psychotherapy, Sacred Science and the Search for Soul. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
I'm happy to be with you again after so many years.
That's right. Very long time.
It is. And it's a pleasure to see you. And it was a real pleasure reading your book. I learned quite a bit myself about how modern culture has interacted with ancient Egypt. And it strikes me that one of the main points that you make is we haven't done so well in terms of understanding the lessons that are there for us in Egyptian culture.
Right. It seems that most modern archaeologists really do focus on the things that we would typically focus on in history. How many battles they had and campaigns, how the dynasties were structured, and who the pharaohs were, and very little is focused on what we would now, or they would now, these archaeologists would consider superstition or religion. They just aren't as important in the culture, it seems. So I do think that there is a lack in the modern perspective.
Well, for a long time, we had no way to interpret the Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Right.
So the Western society was really ignorant about the ancient Egyptian religion for the longest time.
Well, certainly before they were interpreted in the early 1800s through the Rosetta Stone, and most people remember that from history class. There wasn't a lot of understanding of the language, so that was a huge breakthrough. And even Napoleon, when he came into Egypt in the late 1700s, 1798 or so, he brought a whole bunch of scientists with him and was really into this idea of really discovering this lost land. It was like going to another planet to them at the time. Most of the temples were even under sand during that time, and the other things that they were looking at. So I would say from the late 1700s, early 1800s is when the modern idea of Egyptology started to take root.
And I suppose, and I don't think this is in your book, but I know the Bible, which is a very important book in Western culture, references Egypt. In fact, the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, and it's one of the most frequent words that appears in the Hebrew Torah, but it means a narrow place.
Oh, okay.
And that would be the Hebrew meaning, having to do with the Nile River, which is where the population was situated, and that narrow band of land. But it came to be thought of, I think, as a place of narrow thinking. And maybe from a Jewish perspective, since the Jews believed themselves to have been slaves in Egypt, that was the case. But in your investigations, since the Rosetta Stone, and we've begun to interpret the hieroglyphs and understand more about the Egyptian philosophy and religion. I don't think would describe it as a narrow place at all.
Oh, absolutely not. And when you're looking at Egypt through the lens of Christianity or through the lens of Judaism, it certainly would have very different meaning. I mean, there was only a very brief time in Egyptian history where they believed in a single God with Akhenaten, and the brief monotheistic
episode.
Right. So the idea of Egyptians being slaves, and that was essentially whether you would call it fabricated or what, I don't know. But no, they were very, in what I believe, very, very deep in their cosmology and in their religious beliefs. And that. So,
well, I do have the impression that a lot of the early writings having to do with the Egyptian religion, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, was written specifically for the pharaoh, who was regarded as a god king. And these were instructions for the journey of the pharaoh in the afterlife, not necessarily for the average person.
Well, there's a lot of controversy around that. I think originally, or I think it may even be now, the mainstream. I don't know a lot about what mainstream archaeology or Egyptology says about those kinds of details. But there's been a lot of authors since then that have investigated, like Theodore Abt, who looks at, even Carl Jung in depth psychology, who has looked at alchemy as well as the journey through the underworld as being a psychological journey that was for everyone.
Now, our viewers probably don't know that alchemy is actually derived from the ancient name for Egypt.
Kemet or Chemi, black earth. It was, yes.
Now, and what's that connection between black earth and alchemy?
I don't really know. I think the black earth came from the Nile, from the rich, fertile lands from the Nile. And I'm not really even sure exactly when the word Egypt was attributed to the country of
as I recall
Egypt.
From your book, it's a Greek word.
Yes. Egyptos. Yeah.
So it probably had something to do with the Ptolemies and the Greek conquest.
What a lot of people don't understand or are not really familiar with is that the last part of what we consider Egyptian history was really Greek. The Ptolemies, after Alexander the Great, who essentially gave Egypt to one of his generals, Ptolemy. Which was about 325 or so BC. So
Cleopatra was, in fact,
she was Greek. She didn't have a drop of Egyptian blood in her, as they like to say. So the most famous Egyptian wasn't even Egyptian, really. So things changed. I mean, they really they certainly took in the Egyptian cosmology, religion, whatever the Greeks did. So they considered themselves very much the line of the pharaohs and that they were Egyptian. But it did change quite a bit.
And one of the extraordinary things about Egyptian culture is that it lasted for thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. It is extraordinary. And remained pretty much the same during that whole time. There were, of course, differences in structures and things, but for 3,000 years to remain essentially the same that it started at is pretty astounding.
It is. In fact, I hope our modern Western culture can last as long.
Right. Well, I think one reason why it did, and this is opinion, that there was a consistency in their viewpoint, in their perspective of what life was and what God was, or what their cosmology was, or whatever. That there was no reason to change it.
Well, in fact, now that you bring it up, I was strongly influenced by the sociologist Pitirim Sorokin, who wrote he founded the Department of Social Relations at Harvard University and wrote a wonderful, massive text called Social and Cultural Relations. And he had used the resources of Harvard to try and examine every culture on the planet. And he determined that cultures swing between two poles that he called sensate, or we could think of as materialistic, and ideational, very spiritual culture, like, say, in the Middle Ages in the West. But ancient Egypt, that lasted for so long, he felt was balanced. They had a real healthy balance between the inner world and the outer world, and that was a stable balance that lasted for thousands of years. Whereas, according to Sorokin, in the West, the only time we have had that kind of a balanced culture was maybe at the height of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and it didn't last that long, maybe a century or two. So a perfectly balanced culture like that seems to be very difficult for us in the West to establish.
Well, one of the things the ancient Egyptians seem to have done, of course, we don't know for sure the way they thought and everything. I mean, we just know what we can put together with what has survived. But it seems that one of the things that was very, very essential to their way of thinking was this balance you're talking about. Was this? They called it Maat, which is to essentially harmonize the inner world, which they believed was within an innate quality of every human being to know what it really is supposed to be, essentially, and have that harmonized with the outer world. So that is a balance, essentially. Now, they, of course, probably didn't see it that way. They didn't think of it as two different things they were balancing. I mean, they were thinking that it was just all it. And
Maat, which is the goddess of truth.
Okay, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that truth, and the book is essentially focusing on this idea that it's a lost goal. It's a lost, concept to want to balance this inner truth that they believed was true, not a question of their own perception of something. It was an inner knowing. It was an inner knowledge with the external physical outside world. But they didn't see the two as separate things. They just saw it as one whole. And I think that's the primary difference, to put it just really succinctly.
Well, as compared to our modern Western culture, which basically since the Renaissance has been materialistic.
Right.
In nature, we have a very one-sided view overall of the world. And you point out, largely, I suppose, as a result of the lack of inner integrity on the West, our interactions with Egypt have been, up until quite recently, largely about grave robbing and stealing their treasures. And even the great archeologists who went into Egypt did more damage than create discoveries.
The original guys, they were from Europe, obviously, most of them, and their original idea about archaeology was gathering things that museums would buy, and they had no care for the culture or for anything that they were looking at, that they were taking these gold and that went all the way up really until the early 1900s. Even Tutankhamun's discovery in 1922 was largely an acquisition of treasures that were just stripped out of the tomb. So,
and even I think the ancient Romans had a very similar attitude about Egypt.
Oh, certainly, going back to the very beginning of it. Yeah.
Well, and I think from what I gather, the ancient Roman culture was also largely materialistic. They were Epicureans.
Well, what is this? What is materialism? I think that has to be kind of investigated and presented as a definition, that the only thing real is a material reality.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the religions don't adhere to that idea. And it isn't really until, of course, Descartes and the whole idea of separating religion or spirituality from the physical world has made the dual split and has split it into a duality. But at the time, they still were largely materialistic, but not as much as we are now. Obviously, religion is kind of, it's like, well, it's okay if you believe that stuff, but it really isn't real.
Yeah.
But it's okay that you believe it as long as you don't use it to
helps
influence.
You to become a good person, a good citizen, stay out of trouble.
It certainly doesn't have a place in science and medicine.
Not integrated into the culture. Whereas you describe in your book that the ancient Egyptians didn't think of religion the way we do as a social institution. It was just part of, not even part, they were just imbued with it.
They didn't say, I mean, we see it as the word religion means da-da-da. And the ancient Egyptians, of course, didn't even have a word that would describe a separation of those two things. It was like a no-brainer for them. It was,
in fact, we don't, to my knowledge, we don't have a name for the ancient Egyptian religion.
I don't think we do. I don't think we do. What sacred science is, what they say, when we hear the word sacred or the phrase sacred science, it is a combination of what we would call religion and the unseen, the non-material, and integrated with the material. One can't exist without the other. A material world has no essence without the unseen world, and the unseen world also requires the physical world too. So.
Well, you are a depth psychologist, meaning that I presume your psychotherapy practice is largely inspired by the works of Carl Jung.
Yes. Yeah.
And if I recall correctly, Jung wrote the book Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And Jung was, not just Jung, but I mean the whole rise of depth psychology and psychoanalysis in Western culture was, I think, a response to a kind of soul loss that reached its peak in the Victorian era, I suspect. Let's talk about that for a moment and contrast it with how you see the ancient Egyptians.
You could define what I talk about in the book. You could define it strictly from a Jungian perspective, or even a transpersonal perspective of psychology. A psychology that does have soul, whatever that is, if we define it that way. But there's a nuance to it. It's a little bit different. It's like, Jung saw his work toward bringing awareness of soul back as primarily for the psyche, for the psychology of the individual. It was more of an internal system of spirit and love and however you would define religion, God, whatever that was, the myth of life. But the Egyptians saw it in everything. I mean, they saw it as a practical process, and how grain is grown, and how structures are built, and how their science and their medicine is conducted. And so there is it may seem as a slight difference, but I don't think depth psychology as it's taught and as it's practiced now encompasses all of that. It's more about an internal, personal, work.
Well, of course, depth psychology today is still like a tiny little island in a big ocean of materialism.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas in the ancient Egyptian culture, you had the whole culture oriented in a very different way.
Yes.
I mean, for example, hieroglyphs. There, we have an alphabet. Our language is linear. Hieroglyphs are spatial. There is a whole different sensibility about when your writing is made out of pictures rather than letters.
It's not, as the ancients saw it, it's not a objective kind of quantifiable system to say that this symbol means this in its definition. The symbol of a flower is the flower. The bird is the bird. It also included what the bird felt like when it was flying, what it felt like or what it was experiencing spiritually, internally, when it was nesting or when it was going through the different seasons. And all of that information is encompassed in that symbol. And it's quite different than the way that we see things. And we may see things that way. I mean, it's most often in art that we have the same kind of thing. You listen to a beautiful piece of music or look at a beautiful piece of art. There's more to just saying, well, there's red right there. It's like 2 inches from the this. I mean, we don't quantify it. But so we do have that feeling. But they saw that in everything. It was like everything had that kind of living quality to it. And that's quite different. Because they saw it as having value, not just that feels good, the music is happy, and it feels, whatever it might be.
Well, we often think of things in terms of their usefulness, not their value.
Exactly, exactly. Well, that's the consumer attitude, or paradigm of consuming.
Well, interestingly, since the Rosetta Stone, which is now more than 200 years ago, I believe, there have been many scholars who have attempted to recover aspects of the spiritual beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, and I think they've had quite an influence, at least in terms of inspiring esoteric traditions here in the West.
Yes.
And I know you've studied many of the more recent writers who speculate about what it was like in ancient times in Egypt.
That is the big mystery, I think. And one of the things that I point out in the book that I think is very important is that we can't rely on this kind of, I mean, it's almost I shouldn't say arrogance, it's too strong of a word, but this insistence that an ancient culture like that could be essentially the same as ours. And I think most archaeologists, and I'm not speaking for all of them, but I think most of them look at it in terms of that. They still did things that we do. They have wars. They've discovered shopping lists and things like that. So obviously they are human and they have human traits. But this difference, this way of thinking of everything being sacred and everything having this connection with Maat, and this idea that we are trying to reflect this inner perfect world with, the outer world. Is a very different way of thinking, and everything's going to be affected by that. And archaeology, modern archaeology, conventional archaeology, and everything else since, things like psychology and cognitive behavioral psychology, it's all very quantifiable. It's looking at things like, if you think this way, then this will be your behavior. And if you want to change behavior, you can change this way that you think. I mean, it has validity. I mean, it's not like that's a stupid idea. I mean, it obviously has positive effect, but it's not the whole story, in my opinion. And I focus a lot in the book about this idea that these people could have been radically different in the way that they lived.
Well, they were supported by a culture that encouraged and rewarded this way of being in the world. Whereas today, if you are a adept psychologist or a parapsychologist or a person who is deeply engaged in what you call sacred science, you're on the fringes of society for the most part.
Oh, yeah. And again, it's all from this kind of quantifiable cause and effect position. Doctors are fired they're kicked out of the OR if they say to their team, let's all hold hands and have a moment of contemplation here about the surgery we're about to perform, and it doesn't have to be religious. I mean, I don't mean any particular religion like Christianity or whatever, but it's just this acknowledging this inner. It is subjective in some senses, but in other senses it's not really subjective. It's an objective sense of connection and unity, and so we definitely don't honor that.
And I know one of the things that impressed you perhaps the most about Egypt, and I know you've been there on many occasions, is that the monuments that are left, the great stone monuments of different kinds and blocks of stone that have been moved, and sometimes they fit together perfectly in spite of their enormous size. And we know they carried these huge stones great distances. And you mentioned the Serapeum, one of the underground temples where the sacred bull was entombed.
Supposedly.
So, what you discovered in there are huge granite blocks inside of limestone caverns where it appears there's barely any room for those blocks to have entered. So I know it's given you pause to consider that perhaps the ancient Egyptians had an understanding of mind-matter interactions that eludes us today.
Well, now we're getting into the hard stuff, because we can talk about religion, quote unquote, we can talk about this spirituality, this idea of the internal world being as important as the external world. But when we get into the material world being manipulated, just like talking about the doctors and operating, that's a very material process.
Yep.
But if we get into this idea that, wait, well, maybe possibly their way of thinking with this, inner and outer world integration, that they actually could manipulate matter in a way that is like mind over matter. It very well could be that. I kind of go around in the book, not directly at that, although once in a while I'll mention it, because I want people to really kind of contemplate this stuff rather than just immediately say, oh, this is ridiculous.
Well, we don't know for sure what the ancient Egyptians did, but we do have, and you highlight this in your book, and you and I are going to do a separate conversation on this topic. We have research today in the field of parapsychology and the area of macro psychokinesis. So we have good reason today to think that these things are possible, and I certainly can't think of any reason why the ancient Egyptians wouldn't have known about it and possibly known a great deal more than modern society. Yeah.
If you create, like one of my efforts in the book is to create this foundation of really truly understanding how they could see things in this way, that there is a logical movement toward, well, maybe that's how they did this stuff. And that's the reason why I focus on that, because there's no question that, talk about the Serapeum, there's like no question that these 60-ton boxes are sitting there underground. The ground wasn't built over them. They had to be brought into those little tiny rooms. And they're cut out of completely solid granite. And there's a hole in them. It's like a box, but they're not made out of separate pieces. And the right angles are perfectly right angles. There's all kinds of things about these, the intricacies of how they were or what they are, physically. And they're there. So it's like, how did they get there? And there really isn't any very clear theory about this. We just, it's what promissory materialism. I think it was Russell Targ that came up with this idea where it's like, well, we know it's physical. We know it's material. We just don't know how at this point. And that's a cop-out, in my opinion. So it certainly makes logical sense if you follow this, that if the ancient Egyptians really did have this ability to be able to integrate the internal world, the unseen world, with the material world, that there's no reason why they couldn't have manipulated it and been able to move it through things like have, mind over matter. Carl Jung talks a lot about this. There is a lot of references in his work about the idea of the psyche having power. Marie von Franz talks about it, the power of being able to manipulate matter. It's like psyche to matter as opposed to matter to psyche. So it's there, but people have been very reluctant to say it. Jung himself, he would not just come out and write and say, well, these people had the power to be able to move objects around and whatever, because it's a dicey area to go into.
Well, we will talk about that more, but I think another interesting point to bring up is that what we think of today as New Age culture, the interest in the human potential movement, the paranormal, the esoteric, I think largely goes back to the 19th century, to movements like Theosophy, to the New Thought movement. And these movements were to some degree inspired by the understanding that there was an esoteric culture back in ancient Egypt.
Yes, and a lot of other ancient cultures. It's not just Egypt. I mean, one of the reasons why I focus on Egypt is personal reasons, and it's also very obvious. It's there. It's not like, oh, well, we thought people thought this way in some culture where there's no evidence of it. But I think, in my opinion, almost all of these religious or spiritual endeavors with Steiner and Blavatsky and on and on and on are essentially based on this idea of matter It's what we call the problem of going from psyche to matter, the psyche to matter problem. And because science essentially says that there's no way to connect those two. How can you move something that's governed by the laws of materiality with a non-material force?
It seems like a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, it does.
I've interviewed the physicist Ed May, who points out even a material particle like a neutrino barely interacts with matter at all. A neutrino could pass right through the whole Earth without necessarily interacting with any particles. So, and that is physical.
Yes. Well, quantum physics, of course, is the it's the part of science that does make that connection between two, but it's so small. It's like, how can that affect the macro world? The macro world still follows the laws of Newtonian physics, cause and effect. But does it? And that's where you have all the mysticism in quantum physics, and of course a lot of the hardcore quantum physicists will say, no, it's not. That's not what this is about. But all of these people that we're talking about, like Jung and these other people, have gone into these ideas. And of course, Jung was around right when quantum physics was first kind of, he worked with Pauli, and he was fascinated with this idea of the observer effect, Schrödinger's cat, the idea of two states can exist at the same time. His whole thing about tension of the opposites, is kind of that same, talking about that same concept. But to go back to the New Age idea, I mean, this idea that our modern religions, or not religions, but spirituality is looking at these things. They're all kind of coming together. And I think it's important that we go past this kind of Cartesian duality and to say, oh, that's spirituality. This is science. Spirituality has nothing to do with the physical laws of a skyscraper being able to stay and not fall down. But does it? And this isn't really investigated. It's so separated. But we look at Egypt and we say, well, they built, supposedly, again, we're not quite sure, at least I'm not, if the Egyptians had actually built a lot of this stuff. But here they built these pyramids, which are some of the most astounding material feats in the world.
Indeed.
To have done that. How did they do that? Through the age-old question, through a materialist paradigm. There's a lot of theories, but they don't seem like, talking about Serapion, same thing. The theories don't seem to hold water, really, if you really investigate it. And I'd have to say anybody that's interested in this needs to go to Egypt and see these things. Because when you go and you see them, that's when you're like going, wait a minute, how could this have happened? Even within the materialist way of looking at it.
Well, I gather your work as a psychotherapist is getting people in touch with the idea that soul is everywhere, psyche is everywhere, that we don't have to be alienated from our own depths.
That's a very good way to put it. It's true. I mean, we're now, if we go to psychotherapy, the purpose of psychotherapy isn't to be able to go out and build pyramids, all right? But within that, most of the conflict that I see in clients that come in with the everyday problems like depression and anxiety, in my opinion, and a depth psychological opinion, is anything new, is to say that there's a disconnect between these two realities as being one reality. Again, I'm phrasing it as a dualistic idea because it isn't dualistic. It shouldn't be, at least. But, look at our separation from nature itself and our feeling it's not important to connect with the natural world.
I think most Americans are instinctively dualists.
Oh, yeah, of course.
We think, for example, that what goes on inside of me and what goes on outside of me are like two different worlds.
Do you think that's instinctive, or do you think that's largely taught?
It's
taught by the culture over hundreds of years.
It's so deeply embedded in our current culture, it's hard to separate out. But your investigations of ancient Egypt suggest that it is taught.
Yeah, right. And I see this conflict in clients too. where they go, I can't go there. This doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make objective, material sense. And so they don't go there. But when they do, things clear up. You know, and I mean, there's a famous story about Jung talking to von Franz when she first met him about a client he had that was on the moon, and in one of her, you know, expressions of a dream or something, that she was on the moon battling some demon. And von Franz said, well, Dr. Jung, you mean she was figuratively on the moon. She wasn't actually on the moon. He said, no. She was actually on the moon. That's the reality. The illusion is this, you know, physical ball in space. That's the illusion. But the reality is what she created in her mind. And, you know, Jung didn't want anybody to think he was a mystic. He was very concerned about his reputation as a medical doctor. So he was careful with writing about things like that and expressing them. But if you really study his work, it's pretty clear that he would be right on board with this idea of the ancient Egyptians or any of these other cultures. So.
Well, Dr. Todd Hayen, this has been an enlightening conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I would encourage our viewers to look at ancient Egypt a little more, see what we can learn from it. I think there are lessons from every ancient culture that modern people could benefit from.
That's great. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.